Good morning, and good morning, Graham. Graham didn't want a funeral service, and he didn't want any religious rites. So I think today this is a bon voyage gathering from his friends and his admirers all over Australia. And here we are in a small theatre, which is very appropriate because some of Graham's earliest performances were in what is literally called the Little Theatre, which is now the St. Martin's, in Melbourne. Now, theatre is a place of laughter and applause, things which Graham, and indeed every performer, loves to hear. So don't be inhibited by the solemnity of the occasion. Where appropriate, let's hear laughter, let's hear applause, as indeed you've already started doing. Thank you. There's been a lot of tributes coming to Graham, and a full house here is a sign of that, something he would have welcomed, and hopefully a lot of ratings at home. The tributes have come in from all over. He was much loved, and there's no better epitaph for anyone than to say he was much loved. I'd like to give my own tributes to some other people who cared for Graham in the last years of his life. Tony Sattler and Nolene Brown made... In his last couple of years, they gave Graham comfort and dignity. And also to Sam Chisholm, who made sure the bills were paid. Delivering a eulogy for a close friend and for someone who is so much admired is never a happy occasion. Though I must confess I would be quite happy to deliver a eulogy for a certain media personality who's tried the second Kennedy assassination of our time. And failed. I have some messages here from people who've worked with Graham. From Rosemary Margin in Melbourne, who was with Graham on IMT. Rosemary says, "My special times with you will never be forgotten. The funny, the clever, the sad. You'll always be in my heart. Thanks for the memories." And from Barry Creighton in Hollywood, he says, "Graham was the very foundation of Australian television. He was the boldest entertainer of not only his generation, but possibly of any generation in the television medium. There was only one Graham Kennedy, and he was indeed the king." Today, in this audience, there's a wonderful feeling of affection, and that's personified in the lyrics of this song, which is going to be sung to us by John Paul Young. Thank you, John. I have a feeling that's not the first time you've sung that. It's now my pleasure to introduce a lady who is a close friend, a carer, and a co-star, and a wonderful lady, Noeline Brown.
I didn't think Graham was ever going to die. I thought a few times we got close and we'd had memorial services organised and he got better. So I was always expecting him to get better. In fact, I said to Tony, he's going to outlive both of us. So I've just got a few memories of Graham when he came to live in the Southern Highlands. They're not early show business memories, but he was really happy here because he was almost anonymous. Everyone knew it was Graham wearing a disguise, but they just sort of wave and pass by. He had a wonderful time living on his farm with his wonderful big Clydesdale horse, an ex-Carlton United draft horse, and a beautiful dog called Henry. Henry's mother is here today. She wanted me to know Mari's here. I'd just like to tell you about how he acquired Henry. He had a vet living nearby who said, I think you've got your horse, you should have your dog. So he said, well, yes, I'd like to audition a few dogs. So he went along to Mari and Mari's husbands, and they breeded golden retrievers. They bred golden retrievers. And he thought that there was one that was small and was the runt of the pack and had been castrated because no good for breeding purposes. So Graham said, I decided on Henry because all the other dogs were poking fun at him because he had no balls. So they were wonderful friends, and Mari brought along a photograph of Henry, and that's going to go with Graham and it's going to be cremated because Mari and I both believe that Henry and Graham are going to be together in heaven. But when Graham first came to live here, he asked me where I shopped, so I told him a few places to go, and he lived at Canyon Lee, and the place I used to go for my veggies was at Scarlett's at Burrawang, a distance of some 40 k's from Canyon Lee. So Graham went there one day and he got his veggies, and a woman was looking at him, a person who must have been a local, and she said, when he'd gone to the greengrocer, was that Graham Kennedy? And he said, yes, it was. And she said, does he come all this way to get his veggies? And he said, yes, because it was 40 or 50 k's. And she said, that's amazing. He lives in Melbourne. So he had another mate who was a butcher who's also here today, David Fairall. And they became really good mates. And it was David used to call Graham Mr. K, and Graham used to call David Fairall Mr. F. And occasionally they'd have a little drink of red wine in the freezer sometimes. But Graham, who was offered many, many thousands of dollars to do commercials and would knock them back, said, would you like me to do your radio commercials on 2ST for David Fairall? And the cost of those commercials to Graham was a couple of chops and some sausages and some meat for Henry. So he rang his agent, James Laurie, my agent too, and said, would you like half a sausage by way of commission? So they're the happy times that Graham had here. When he became ill this last time, and we knew that he was probably not going to last, we were actually arranging for a meeting with Daryl Summers before he got ill, so I'm sorry, Daryl, that never happened. But I visited him many times, and even though he was under, a lot of medication, he'd wake up and he'd smile, he'd say, hello, darling, and I'd say, is there anything you like? And he loved Passiona, was his favourite last drink, which might come as a surprise to everyone who knew that he loved Grange. So when I came in on the last day, about 10 hours before he died, I said, darling, is there anything you would like? Would you like an ice cream? Because he liked ice cream as well. And he made a noise rather like the crow call. and said, that'd be crow call, great. So he had a couple of mouthfuls of ice cream, and I left him not realising that he would die about 10 hours later. But one of the nurses who's here today told me that the doctor spoke to him and said, Graham, this time your pneumonia is really, really serious. And he said, what do you mean, doctor? Really serious? He said, yes, Graham, it's really serious. And they realised that this would be it. So the doctor said, is there anything you'd like to ask me, Graham? And he said, yes. Why do you doctors charge so much? I think that's all I've got to say about Graham, except I loved him, he was family, and I'll miss him, but he'll always be here. Next person to talk about him will be John Mangos, who is his mate and friend from Coast to Coast days, but has always been there visiting him. John Mangos.
Thank you, Nolene. He loved you, too. I want to talk about the things that Graham loved. He'd have loved the squabble over broadcast rights for this event. You see, he used to love people fighting over him because it pushed the price up. And if he were here with us alive today, he'd have loved diving into the Macquarie Dictionary and finding just the right words to describe it. A charaban of pensioners outside. A condescension of actors inside. Of course, he loved the Macquarie Dictionary, mostly because it had his name in it. Page 1263 under the word Logie. He was always very quick to remind me of that. Would he have loved the fuss? He'd have said not, but inside he really would have. As much as he rejected love, he craved it. He loved being a star, and as Stuart mentioned earlier, he certainly loved the applause. He also loved being alone. He loved his food and he loved eating out. He loved his first beer at midday, his red wine with lunch, the first gin and tonic at 5 o'clock, and he especially loved it when it was Contra and he didn't have to pay for it. He'd love assassinating characters over a glass of wine or two. Most of you, actually. And he loved frustrating you. He loved knowing that the harder you tried to make contact with him, the more elusive he became. He loved his waterfront at Kirribilli. How inconsiderate, he would say, John, of couples to make love within view on the foreshore. I'd say, yes, Graham, very inconsiderate. He says, do you know how hard it is to hold a pair of binoculars in one hand? But my fondest memories are not necessarily those of the shows we did together or Kirribilli, but of course, as Nolene mentioned, our very warm and loving friendship afterwards. The years at Canyon Lea, on the property he called Clydesdale after the horses that he loved so very much. He was always the perfect host. He loved being the perfect host. As some of you would know, the table was always set immaculately. Always the appropriate cutlery, the appropriate crockery for that specific meal, always. And of course, as most of you would know, most of it was stolen from Qantas First Class over years of travel. Those were the days when it was Wedgwood. In fact, once upon learning of my travel plans, he said, which airline are you flying, John? And I told him Qantas. He said, great. He said, would you be kind enough to get me a saucer? He said, I've broken one and now my set is incomplete. I naturally said I'd oblige, and then I grappled with the guilt. Do I steal one or do I ask for one? Well, as it turns out, I ended up with 2 saucers, because I did both. And then I sent the triumphant fax, announcing that, Graham, what a hero I am. Not one, but I have procured 2 saucers. And immediately came the reply on the fax machine within seconds. Shit, now I need another cup. As many of the people who worked with him would tell you, he loved the fax machine. It gave him ultimate control. He could answer what he wanted and when he wanted, and of course, he loved control. He loved acting. By now, most of you know that most of it was an act. He was really quite insecure and shy. He was never comfortable with undeserved familiarity or vulgarity. And yet, when he was acting, he mastered vulgarity and he dumped it in our living rooms and we lapped it up. We loved it. One of his favourite stories, in fact, on the subject of vulgarity, because he loved his dictionaries, was the woman at the launch of the Funk and Wagnalls. Remember he used to talk about the Funk and Wagnalls dictionary? A woman who complained to one of the authors that it was a fine journal indeed, but what a shame they had scooped so low as to include the F word. And Graham absolutely loved the response of the author. Thank you, madam, but how very low of you for noticing and looking for it. He loved his pencils. He surrounded himself with dozens of cups holding pencils. He loved his pencils because they reminded him of his poverty-stricken childhood when he couldn't afford pencils. He loved Melbourne and he loved the St Kilda Footy Club, and it's nice to see the boys here from the club. And he told me once he loved it when, as King of Moomba, he was helicopter dropped into the middle of the MCG in front of 120,000 people. How do you top that, John? He said to me. He loved being Frank Sinatra's warm-up act during a tour of Australia. He especially loved a gag that he and Frank Sinatra concocted for the after-show parties. He organised it so that Sinatra would come up to him at the after-show party, as if to come up and talk to Graham. And Graham had it all worked out. He'd go, "Leave me alone, Brian, can't you see I'm busy?" Frankie played along with it. He loved it when a young floor wax salesman called Sam Chisholm got down on his hands and knees to polish the floor at Frankston. He still loved you, Sam, even when you became his boss. He adored you. He loved it when he was thrown off air for the Crow Call. Let me tell you a little bit about the background there. He was working variety 5 nights a week, and just like Johnny Carson, he wanted to cut it back to 2 nights a week. It was too much hard work. The network refused, so he broke his contract by breaching broadcast laws, got himself kicked off the air. Yep, he loved being off the air, and then he loved being back at the same network about a year later. Guess what? Doing 2 shows a night. He got his way. He loved me, and he loved my mum. My mum's name's Dot, but he would call her Diamantina. He was on her cooking list, you see. Every Easter and every Christmas, he'd get the Greek Easter cookies and the Greek Christmas cookies. He loved those. He loved inquiring about my upbringing, and he loved family meals together. In fact, he even came to some Mangos family meals together. He seemed to love reliving things that maybe he'd missed out upon in his childhood. I'll close by saying our friend Graham loved a lot of things. I just wish he'd have loved himself as much as we loved him. I'd like to now introduce biographer Graham Blundell. Graham, of course, worked with our Graham in 2 movies, The Odd Angry Shot and Don's Party. Graham Blundell.
Graham Kennedy will always be remembered as Mr. Melbourne by the generations who grew up with him in that city, the way I did. The rest of Australia, of course, called him the King, or just Graham, and for 30 years he was our biggest star. In my time, it was Graham who first led television's comedy charge. He was there at the very beginning, hurling custard pies with jubilation on In Melbourne Tonight, giving his audience countless laughs that were really metaphoric comments, not only on how we lived day to day, but if we really thought about it at all, on the nature of humankind, its frailty, deceptiveness and trickiness. When relaxed and flying in top form, he was impossible to keep up with. It was said that he could read an audience like skywriting. He'd come from radio, but we loved the way that he spent his life laughing at the orthodoxies of television, externalising its workings, lifting his slim digit to its pieties. We talked about it on the buses and the trains and the trams next morning, sending everything and everybody up mercilessly while the studio audience shrieked and howled. There were the trademark fish eyes that said one wag made him look like a famished barracuda. Those ocular reactions, the blank stares and smug looks, and the lightning double takes that were the special Kennedy things. The way he darted around, a pale figure in a dapper suit. He was always dressed to the nines. His assurance was breathtaking as he did his cheeky schoolboy act, igniting outrageous feasts of timing and audience control. The oyster-eyed boy, journalists found 1,000 ways to describe his features, and he didn't like all of them, was hired by Melbourne's new Channel 9 with imitations of the American Tonight shows of Steve Allen in mind. But that initial source of inspiration would never curb the local kid's style. The only similarity was that Graham sat at a desk most of the time. He dealt not in urbanity, but in a manageable sort of iconoclasm, and his timing was right, wrote TV critic Sandra Hall in the 70s. He arrived just before seeing Tonight Show compares fail had been permitted to become just another national sport. It was Graham who first taught us about television. He gravitated towards television like a tuning fork, Noel Ferrier once said, and its power to displace such commodities in our lives as conversation and solitude. Graham was always able to turn adversity into a kind of triumph, ordinariness into adventure of the riskiest kind, and subtle sexual subtext into broad social acceptance. With Bert Newton, he did crosstalk comedy with the immediacy of reminiscing brothers. Sometimes they looked at each other as if searching a shared memory. He believed no single performer in the history of the world had so often been dropped down, blown up, hit, hurt, crushed, smashed, exploded, drowned, shot, clouted, bashed, and generally physically embarrassed more than he had. He reigned over local television for 40 years as talk show host, game show presenter, satirist, commentator, and as an actor of great quality, when briefly he left TV for the film industry. In retirement, he was as modest of his achievements as might be expected of someone who had achieved so much. In his final act of retirement is a living example of the truth that a life lived is more valuable than the creation of any artwork. Graham Kennedy always understood too that in show business, hitting what you aim at is what counts, and above all, knowing when to quit. The show-off, clacking slapstick clown was stage managed by a sophisticated, lonely man who always knew when the party was over. I think people like watching me because I carry on as they would like to if they were put in front of an audience, in front of people, he once said. I don't classify myself as a comedian, though sometimes I'm funny. I can't really sing and I can't dance. I can't really interview anyone, but I can talk. A famous person once said about me that I didn't do anything on television, but I did it better than anyone else. Ladies and gentlemen, some clips of Graham Kennedy doing just that.
Good evening. Don't you hate that commercial? Yesterday I wasn't feeling very well. And I couldn't play with Sharon. I couldn't play with my teddy bear. But last night Mummy gave me a chocolate. Did she ever? Bang!
What do you do for a living, Julie?
I'm a typist.
A typist? At an insurance broker?
No.
At a solicitor's office?
No.
At Coles and Garrard, the famous people who make wonderful sunglasses?
No.
No. Oh, you might be with Massey Ferguson, the people who make wonderful tractors. You're not, by any chance, with Rid milking machines, are you?
No.
Is it possible, one says to oneself, that you're with Custom Carpets?
No.
I know, the Fridge Right Dairy Vat people. You're at the Drew and Butterfat factory. Well, I've guessed as much as I can and got rid of a few debts.
Nothing like jumping around to relax. How do you feel tonight? Oh, shut up, you lot.
An animal lover who thought he'd bred a one-eyed cat discovered that it was entering the room backwards.
You can do so much with them. It's like a foundation for an exciting meal. And Arnott Sayer. Not only that, you can make vanilla slices. Have you seen that commercial? Nice homemade vanilla slice made out of 2 Sayer biscuits. Now about that? Sounds like dysentery, doesn't it? I don't have to eat it tonight, do I? I do have to. Oh, that's good, because I love it. What flavour have we got tonight? Blueberry. The little black things. Yuck. No, it's good, though. It's good. It's Peter's real fruit yogurt, and it tastes delicious. Mmm. I beg your pardon?
Take them all.
Oh, all right. There you are. Dick was dining at the restaurant.
Dick was.
Was Dick ever?
Clever Dick.
Yes. How tall was Dick?
Oh, Dick's about 6'7".
Big Dick.
The 1978 Gold Logie winner is Graham Kennedy.
I would very much like to thank me for having faith in the Reg Grundy organisation.
Was that little bit meant to be humorous at all? Because I've got a hot flash for you.
Graham, I think you need to buy the Women's Weekly to find the answer to that.
All right, well, I'll get my copy shortly. I would do their commercials, you know, if they arrive 72 hours before showtime. But when they telex it down on the same day, I refuse.
Well, let me tell you, I'm happy to be here.
I've got a glandular. Isn't that revolting? I knew Sir Frank too, of course. Graham, you are a bit of a knocker lately. Won't you say one positive thing about someone before the Christmas break? All right, I will. You are a... It's positive. I can't go into my first erotic experience. I can't expand on that. I mean, I remember it as being a very tender, wonderful moment. I just wished at the time, remember thinking clearly, I wish I had some company.
I'd walk 1,000,000 miles for one of your smiles. Mammy.
That's Sam Sutton. We wanted you to meet him. It's just a thrill. Yes, that is a nicely framed picture. Spot Graham Kennedy.
5, 4, 3, 2.
Oh, there you are.
Well, firstly, an apology for not being with you today. You can imagine how much I would like to be there. Graham used to joke with me about the fact that I loved going to a funeral. He used to say it in the nicest possible way. Once he said to me he'd go to the funeral of a joke that died. You know, not too many jokes died with Graham around. If they were dying, all of a sudden he'd throw away the script or throw away the intention of the sketch or the little bit at the desk and start afresh with something new until those laughs started to come again. But we all know that was the sort of performer Graham was. Today, I just want to let you know something that I'm sure you know anyway. Apart from being the best television performer this country has ever seen, it's also worthwhile remembering that the influence that he had on television was quite amazing, the likes of which I can't remember anybody else in one particular medium having the influence that Graham had in television. I said on my show, Good Morning Australia, last Friday morning, that a lot of people are saying that Graham changed Australian television. It's not totally accurate because Graham Kennedy basically started Australian television in terms of tonight shows and chat shows and variety generally. And I know that I wouldn't be sitting here on the set of Good Morning Australia. I don't think Rove would be sitting on the set of Rove Live and all of the other compeers with their shows. They may be working in television, but I don't think they'd be doing precisely what they're doing and what I'm doing. If we were working in television, there's every chance we'd be repairing television sets because before, months after the start of television in Australia, when Graham started in Melbourne Tonight, it was a whole new vista, not just for Australia, but for the world too, because it started out, or supposed to be, and I'm sure you know this story, a Tonight Show like Johnny Carson and Steve Allen and Jack Power and all of those people, but Graham just made it his own. The only similarity was the fact that there was a desk there and there were songs. From a personal point of view, I've known Graham for 50 years. We first met in 1955 when we were both in radio. He was at the Greater 3UZ and I was at the quality station, 3XY. And the friendship began in 1955 and has lasted ever since. A friendship that I hold so dearly. The memories are great, I know, for all of us. And my memory of Graham Kennedy is not just as that wonderful television personality, but somebody with whom it was terrific to spend time. He liked the good things in life. A lot of people say he was a recluse. I know that Noeline and Tony don't agree with that word, nor do I, because he was private and he was shy, but that doesn't make someone a recluse. And speaking of Tony and Noeline, I just wanted to say, from friends who won't be there on this occasion that you're attending, thank you for looking after Graham Kennedy. It hasn't been just something over the last couple of weeks or a couple of months. We're talking about years. He was very lucky to have friends like you, Noeline, and Tony, and I know you considered yourselves lucky that he was your friend. The whole thing was summed up for me on Wednesday of last week when the news came through. Not just the sadness at Graham passing away, but I think Noeline said it for all of us when she said, I saw him only hours before he died. I was sleeping, I was dreaming of Graham, the phone rang and the news came through. And Noeline's last line was, I wish I'd been there to hold his hand. Noeline, that's how we all feel. And thank you for letting me say these few words.
Bert Newton, who keeps the flag flying for the standard that Graham set every day on his Good Morning Australia show and every evening on stage with the producers. I don't know how he does it. If I might digress just for a moment, Noeline, you learned a lot from Graham. Graham was the king of the freebies, and today you have mentioned every tradesman in Bowral you will eat for free for your... Bert's wife, Patty, has sent this message. All that Bert has said about Graham is how I feel. I've always loved him personally and professionally. Graham used to say on IMT, we're going to make a star of Patty McGrath. Well, that didn't happen, but I got to work with the king, and that made me at least feel like a star. Graham, you'll always be in my heart. I've also got a message from Carol Ray, who was with us on Blankety Blanks, and Carol said, I never ceased to be amazed at his professionalism and skill. In show after show, he made it seem so easy, more like play than work. I'll always remember his mischievous, irreverent, and bawdy sense of humour. His contribution to our profession has been enormous. Graham loved writers. He realised, as we all come to eventually, that without the writers there is no show. Right from the early days with Freddie Parsons and Ernie Carroll, right up to Gary Riley and Tony Sattler, he admired them all. And someone who wrote for all of us who were at Channel 9 in those days was the gentleman who we're going to hear from now, Mr. Mike McCall Jones.
Thank you, Stuart. We all know Graham loved the fax machine. He loved receiving faxes, but he particularly loved sending faxes. I was wondering this morning just what I could say. And I received a fax from Graham, from heaven. God knows how he got the number. I guess that's how he got the number. And I thought I might read it to you. So this is a fax from Graham, from heaven. Dear Mike, Speak up and don't faint. Graham knows how terrified I am. You know how much I loathe flying. This was the smoothest flight I ever had. Not one bump. Good airline food too. Great airline, Air God. It was fascinating to see airline food being served by nuns. When I arrived, I was greeted by this old bloke with a white beard. He looked like me in sketches. I helped him drag some cases of grog in through the pearly gates, which, by the way, are plastic. Gee, they think of everything up here. 50 crates of gin and tonic and a lovely bucket of ice, all ready for me. The guy I helped is already a chum. I call him St. Peter the Phantom Puller. Met some really interesting people on the weekend. Henry VIII. He told me he liked the way I threw the chicken on the floor for Bert to pick up. John Logie Baird. He said he's going to name an award after me, the Cyril. And Dick Turpin. He told me a very funny joke. Did Dick? Dick did. Clever Dick. Dead Dick. Page 2. I hear Darren outed me. I've got a hot flash for him. It's rife up here. Only a few minutes ago, I saw Oscar Wilde holding hands with Chips Rafferty. I reckon if Hinch's body is ever washed up on a beach, police will be interviewing suspects for 7 years. I'm having a drink tonight at the Cloud Club with some old chums. Joff, Rosie, Norm Spencer, Johnny Ladd, Buster Fidesz, Tommy Hanlon, Senior and Junior, Al Jolson, Dean Martin, and you'll never guess who the barman is, Johnny Million. Do you know who I saw on Friday afternoon? Rover Boy, Rover the Wonder Dog. He's still peeing. I must go now. I'm about to meet the big G, God. I said he could come over at 2 o'clock. Love to Tony, Nolene and all. Graham. Oh, there's a P.S. P.S. I almost forgot. You'll never guess who I had dinner with last night. Joan of On behalf of Freddie Parsons, Ernie Carroll, my family, all Australians and particularly Melburnians, thank you, Graham. If Graham ever wanted to lift a show when it was flagging, he always got the audience to move into it and help along with some songs. This is really hard for me because it does involve singing. we do have the leader of the Mittagong Glee Club here. And one of Graham's favourites was the Chum song, so I urge you all to sing along a lot louder than me, please. Being a chum is fun, that is why I'm one. Always smiling, always gay, chummy at work and chummy at play. Laugh away your worries, don't be sad or glum, and everyone will know that you're a chum, chum, chum. Faster, Jeffrey?
Certainly.
Being a chum is fun, that is why I'm one. Always smiling, always gay, chummy at work and chummy at play. Laugh away your worries, don't be sad or glum, and everyone will know that you're a chum, chum, chum. Thank you very much.
Always smiling, always gay. They don't write songs like that anymore, do they? Music was always a great part of Graham's life. He loved it. And who can forget the duets he did with Evie Hayes, with Elaine McKenna, and with this wonderful lady who's coming on now, who was indeed a compere herself of IMT, the first woman compere of a Tonight Show in the world, the inimitable Miss Tony Lamond.
When Graham was at his height, I was in musical theatre, and he used to say to me, "Gee, Lamond, you're so lucky to do a musical." There he was, king of the world, but he would love to have done a stage musical, most particularly How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. He never got to do it, but I'll bet, if heaven's what I think it is, right now he's auditioning for Frank Lesser, the composer. And this is in your honour, darling. You have the cool, clear eyes of a seeker of wisdom and truth. Yet there's that upturned chin and that grin of impetuous youth. Oh, I believe in you. The sound of good, solid judgment whenever you talk. Yet there's that bold, brave spring of a tiger that quickens your walk. Oh, I believe in you. I believe in you. And when my faith in my fellow man all but falls apart, I've just to see your hand grasping mine, and I take heart to see the cool, clear eyes of a seeker of wisdom and truth. Yet there's that slam, bang, tang, reminiscent of gin and vermouth. Oh, I believe in you. I believe in you. And when my faith in my fellow man all but falls apart, I've but to feel your hand grasping mine, and I take heart to see the clear, cool eyes of a seeker of wisdom and truth. Yet there's that slam, bang, tang, reminiscent of gin and vermouth. I believe in you, Graham, darling. I always believed in you.
Thank you, Tony. It's wonderful to look around this audience here today and see so many people from the early days of television. It's a bit like walking through Madame Tussauds, but... In the 70s, Graham started a new career as a film actor, and a very successful career it was. He took up the challenge with his usual aplomb, and again, he valued the writers more than anything. And a gentleman who wrote 3 of the movies in which Graham played is here to pay tribute, Mr. David Williamson.
I first saw Graham when I was only 16. He was on IMT. The impact was enormous on me. Suddenly, staid, puritanical Melbourne was undermined and subverted by his wicked, impish spirit. Graham became our alter ego, the person we would have loved to have been if only we'd been as talented, quick, witty, and wickedly evil as he was. So it was a great thrill for me that this talented man, my boyhood hero, brought to life so wonderfully 3 of my characters in a way no one else could have done. Ted Parker, the pie manufacturing president of the club that hadn't won a premiership for 19 years. He created a poignant and touching portrait of a man out of his depth, a man whose tragedy was that he never had the ability to play the game he loved with the team he loved, a man who didn't know the knives were out for him already. And I'll always treasure the way Graham played his final scene. The axe had fallen, and he gathered all his frail dignity, and our heart went out to him as he was banished from the club he loved. And the sad, bewildered loser, Mac, in Don's party, wondering why life had never worked out for him. And as the lonely neighbour Freddie in Travelling North, craving the friendship that Leo McKern was very reluctant to give him. Yes, Graham could make us laugh. Yes, his comic timing was impeccable, but Graham could also create a character your heart went out to, that you cared about and almost wept for. And that's the mark of a great actor, one who can wear human frailty on his sleeve and make us laugh and cry. Graham has passed on, but his huge talent will be with us forever on the big screen, and for that I'm tremendously grateful. Now, Jack Thompson can't be here today in person, but the morning wouldn't be complete without a word from him. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you for introducing me to Graham, because if we hadn't done the club together, then I probably wouldn't have got to know him quite so well. He was a good friend. But I had already met Graham on a number of occasions. Whenever we made another film and went out there to promote it, Graham always provided us with the most fabulous support. He was a great supporter of the Australian film industry and ultimately made a great contribution to it in his portrayal of Ted in The Club. I think one of the great comedy performances of Australian film. You were not only the king, mate. You were our court jester. We'll miss you. Vale, Graham.
Graham wasn't a religious man, but if he has gone to meet his maker, I like to think that the scene is pretty much as depicted in Bill Leake's cartoon, which is on the back of your programs, and I think, perhaps not, coming up on the screen. There is Graham arriving in heaven to a great mob of his old chums welcome him with a mighty hurrah. No, it's not coming up. It was a good idea at the time. Graham is going to have the final word, as always. He sings For All We Know, and as he does that, the president, the coach, the captain, and the members of his beloved St Kilda AFL team will be bearing him away. When that happens, let's give him one mighty last standing ovation, shall we? Here is Graham to sing For All We Know. Goodbye, Graham. We'll miss you.
We know we may never meet again. Before you go, make this moment sweet again. We won't say goodnight until the last minute. I'll hold out my hand. My heart will be in it. For all we know, this may only be a dream. We come and go like the ripple on a stream. So love me tonight. Tomorrow was made for some. Tomorrow may never, never come. For
let's all join and stand up and sing it, please.